Maybe you've sat through some presentations that put you to sleep. Another boring PowerPoint presentation, right? You don't want to be that presenter, do you? This is Diane Windingland with Virtual Speech Coach to help you with some techniques to power up your PowerPoint. Tip number 1, don't start with the boring agenda slide as your very first slide. Open with something that has a little more engagement in it, like I did with the slide of the people sleeping at a meeting. After that, it's a good idea to let people know what you're going to cover with an agenda slide. In this presentation, I will give you some tips and techniques to plan your presentation, use 3 easy design principles, make information visual, and make data meaningful. You want to start with planning. Failing to plan is planning to fail. In your planning, start with why. Why does your audience care? Know their pain points. Know why your topic is important to them. After why, then plan. Don't start your planning in PowerPoint. At best, you'll waste time by creating slides that you won't use, and at worst, you'll end up with a presentation that totally misses the mark. I often plan in stages, starting with a mess of sticky notes and then organizing the sticky notes into sections or points. This was the initial plan for a longer presentation on PowerPoint. I came up with some ideas. Some of them I didn't use. And it was so much easier to just take a sticky note off the door and throw it away than it would have been to get rid of a slide that I might have spent an hour working on. Plan first. Now, you don't need a degree in graphical design to create effective PowerPoint slides. My design motto: simple is almost always best. Here are 3 easy design principles: go big, the rule of thirds, and less is more. Principle number 1, go big. Here's a typical slide with the title on top and an image in the image space. It's not terrible, but there's one simple thing you can do to make it much more engaging. Go big. Why not just let the picture take up the whole slide? It will have a much greater impact. You could even add a word if it works with the picture and is relevant to your point. Principle number 2, the rule of thirds. This is a principle of photography that you can use in some of your slides. Here's another typical slide. Here I've made it bigger and I've also cropped differently using the rule of thirds. The idea is to imagine your slide divided into thirds, horizontally and vertically, and place the horizon and subjects at the 1/3 or 2/3 positions for greater visual interest. Here the horizon is 1/3 down, and the subject, the tree, is about 1/3 from the bottom and 1/3 from the left. Now you'll notice I didn't make it perfectly 1/3 from the left, and that was just to let you know you don't have to be perfect. You don't need a grid to do this. You can eyeball it. Now where the 1/3 lines meet are the PowerPoints of your PowerPoint and good spots to consider for subject placement. You can do the same with people. Not having your subject always in the center can make it more visually interesting. Here's a bonus tip on picture placement. What does this eye tracking study tell you? Now, the places people look the most are red, followed by yellow and green. What's the difference between the picture on the left and the one on the right? Well, in the picture on the left, the baby is facing forward, and on the right, the baby is facing the words. We all look at faces first. So if you want people to look at the words that are also on your slide, try whenever possible to have the faces, if they're people, facing the words, because people will want to look where the face or the eyes are looking. Here's a bit of a bad example, or maybe it's actually a good example of what not to do. We look at the face first, and she's looking off screen, which leads our eyes away from the quote. We could just move the picture over to the right, which is a little bit better, but because we tend to want to go from left to right, we look at her face on the right and then have to jump back to the left. What might have been better would have been to take the original picture, this picture, flip it, and keep it on the left, like this. Now we look at her face on the left, and her eyes guide us to the right to read the quote. Try this technique for some of your slides. Principle number 3, less is more. What do you think the number one problem with PowerPoint presentations is? If you said something like too much information, you're right. People tend to put too much on their slides. Did you even see significance? In the sea of information, significance was lost. Try to have only one main idea per slide. Maybe you've heard of the 6x6 rule. Here's the 6x6 rule. No more than 6 bullets per slide, no more than 6 words per bullet. Don't wrap your points past one line. Fade in bullets one at a time. This rule is better than wall of text. Ugh, boring, too much information. Do you like to have slide after slide with text and bullet points? No. Try to make some of your information visual. Here's a before slide where I talk about in an introduction to a speech, you want to have the 3 P's. Pep, a call to action or something to get attention, like a story. Promise, state the benefit. Path, preview your points. This isn't terrible, not too much text, but what about using a more visual approach? And I just did this with Smart Art. You can even use the animations to make your points come in one at a time, like this. In addition to making your information visual, try to make your data meaningful. You don't want to do a data dump on your audience. You don't have to present all your data as long as you have the documentation to give the details. Here's a before slide of weekly food consumption, comparing a family in the United States with a family in Chad, Africa, with the focus really being on how much they spent. I could limit the information and not have as much information and just focus on the actual dollar amount. I could try a chart. Well, it looks a little silly in this particular example. Or you've probably heard that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Here is a picture of a family of 4 in the United States and their weekly food consumption. Compare that with the family in Chad. They have 2 more people too. A picture is really worth 1,000 words. If you can show a picture and tell a story, it will connect even more with your audience. As you're considering the presentation of data, ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, what do you want to say? What is the impact to the audience, to the organization? Number 2, what is the data saying? And number 3, what does the audience need to hear? Different audiences perhaps need different interpretations of the data, different levels of detail, for example. Here's an example. With the lifetime risk of cancer, 38.4% of people will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. Let's say the audience is a group of parents of newborns, and let's ask the 3 questions. Number 1, what do you want to say? That the lifetime risk of cancer is significant. Number 2, what does the data say? That 38.4% of people will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. Now, if you want the number to be a little more memorable, you might say nearly 40% or nearly 2 out of 5 people will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. Number 3, what does the audience need to hear? This audience might need to hear that their child is at significant risk of developing cancer, impacting their hopes and dreams for their child. What do parents hope and dream for their children? That could create a display of the data that really hits home. A picture representation. Cancer is not a parent's hopes and dreams for a child, but for nearly 2 out of 5 children, it will be a reality. If you can take your data, your facts, and make them story-like or wrap them in a story, especially stories of individuals, they can be more memorable. As cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner says, a fact wrapped in story is 22 times more memorable. Well, sometimes you have more data than you can really just show with a picture. So you have to ask yourself, would a chart help? And what chart? Here is a set of data on the number of U.S. households with pets by type of animal. What chart do you think would be best for displaying this data? Let's take a look at each type. Here's the data in a pie chart. There's a few problems. In this case, the categories are not discrete parts of a whole, which is what this pie chart indicates. The categories often overlap. People often own more than one type of pet. Another problem is that it's hard to estimate the sizes of circular segments. If we added percentages, that might help, but then this chart becomes even more cluttered. What about a line chart? This just looks wrong, doesn't it? That's because line charts are typically used to show trends, and categories aren't trends. How about a column chart? This is a little bit easier to read, but again, it looks a little like a trend, and because the labels are slanted, it's a little bit difficult to read. If we turn a column chart on its side, you have a bar chart. This is easier to read, and the category titles are horizontal in this case. But could we make this even better? We could take away the grids and add the data. We actually have more information, but it looks a little less cluttered when we make that modification. But what about trying something else, like a tree map? Well, was interesting when I did it. I thought, oh, this is a lot easier to read than a pie chart, but could I make it even more visual so people would be able to grasp the information right away? Yes, I could make it more visual by adding in icons for the various types of animals. People could quickly see the type of animal and the portion of households that own a pet of that type. Take these tips and power up your PowerPoint. Go big, consider using the rule of thirds, and less is more. Less is more also means to make information visual and to make your data meaningful. Never have another boring PowerPoint. This is Diane Windingland with Virtual Speech Coach, and I hope these tips will help you keep your audience awake and engaged.